Hello student, I am Professor Pallavi Devkate welcomes you in next practical of Elective Econ 354 course title is Agribusiness Management. Okay, in previous lecture we studied about calculation of NPW, BCR and IRR. Okay, in today's session we are going to learn about different taste ratios on balance sheet. That means in this lecture we studied the analysis of balance sheet. Already the theoretical part of balance sheet we covered in previous lecture. Okay, so uh, here is example. Calculate current ratio, intermediate ratio, net capital ratio, debt equity ratio and equity value ratio from following information. Okay, so these are the data which is given, that is current asset, current liability, intermediate liability and long term liability. Okay, from this data you have to find out these 5 ratio. Okay, so one by one we calculate different taste ratios. So first, that is current ratio. So formula for current ratio is total current asset divided by total current liability. By putting the values of current assets and current liability we calculate the current ratio of balance sheet. So by calculating this ratio, your final answer will be 2.29. Okay, so this current ratio indicate the capacity of farmer to meet immediate financial obligation. That means if this current ratio is more than 1, then it indicate favorable run of business. Okay, so this current ratio indicate liquidity position of the farmer within a 1 year. This is the current ratio, that is total current asset divided by total current liability. Okay, after current ratio, second ratio, that is intermediate ratio. The formula for intermediate ratio is equal to current asset plus intermediate asset divided by current liability plus intermediate liability. Okay, so putting the values in a formula we can calculate the intermediate liability. So here the current assets are 1,59,174.61 plus intermediate assets are 41,612 divided by current liability, that is 69,314.40 plus intermediate liability, it is 15,050. Okay, so by calculating these we can get the intermediate ratio which is 2.37. Okay, on the basis of intermediate ratio conclusion can be made. That means this intermediate ratio indicate the liquidity position of a farm business over a intermediate period, that means ranging from 2 to 5 years. Similarly, if this intermediate ratio is more than 1, then it indicate sound running of business. Okay, this is the second ratio, that is intermediate ratio. After that, third ratio, that is net capital ratio. So formula for net capital ratio is equal to total assets divided by total liability. So this total assets is nothing but the summation of current asset plus intermediate asset plus in long term asset, whereas the total liability is nothing but the summation of current liability plus intermediate liability plus long term liability. Okay, by putting the values in a formula we get the total assets and total liability, and by taking this ratio of these two we get net capital ratio which is 3.65. Okay, so this net capital ratio indicate solvency position of the farmer. That means if this net capital ratio is more than 1, then it indicate the funds of financial institutions are safe. Okay, so this is the third ratio, that is net capital ratio. Okay, about 3 ratio, that is current ratio, intermediate ratio and net capital ratio. If these 3 ratios are greater than 1, then it indicate sound running of business. Okay, then after that, next ratio, that is debt equity ratio. So debt equity ratio, formula for debt equity ratio is equal to total liabilities divided by owner's equity. Okay, so these total liabilities are the summation of current liability plus intermediate liability plus long term liability, and this owner's equity is the difference between total assets and total liability. So this is the total assets and this is the total liability. So the difference between this total assets and total liability is equal to owner's equity, and by taking the ratio of these two, that is total liabilities upon owner's equity, we get debt equity ratio, which is 0.37. Okay, this debt equity ratio indicate farmers immediate financial obligation. That means if this debt equity ratio is less than 1, then it indicate healthy performance of the business. That means this debt equity ratio is always less than 1, it is favorable for the business. Okay, after that, next ratio, that is equity value ratio. Okay, so formula for equity value ratio is equal to owner's equity divided by value of asset. So already we calculate the owner's equity, that is total assets minus total liability, and value of asset is nothing but the summation of assets, that is current asset plus intermediate asset plus long term asset. Okay, by taking this ratio we calculate the equity value ratio. So here the equity value ratio is 0.72. Okay, this equity value ratio indicate the productivity gained by the farmers in relation to asset that he has. Okay, that means if this equity value ratio is less than 1, then it indicate healthy performance of the business. That means the equity value ratio which is less than 1, it is beneficial or favorable for that particular business organization. Okay, these are the 5 test ratio we can calculate from the balance sheet. This equity value ratio and debt equity ratio always less than 1 is favorable for the business performance. Okay, so this is the next practical, that is analysis of different financial test ratios from balance sheet. Okay, so you have to calculate all these ratio. If any query, then ask me. Okay, thank you all.